Okay, historians, so now we're going to start establishing patterns in these first states. So we're looking at, these are things that every single state, every single civilization, complex urban society, if you will, had. So the first thing that all of these societies had was specialization of labor. This is because not everyone needed to farm. Because farmers could create a surplus. And this led to the branching out of roles. So you had like people like, well, government officials, priests, who were often connected to government, artisans and craftsmen, usually men, but I'm going to write craftspeople because sometimes they were women, especially in terms of weaving, artisans, and these craftspeople and artisans might be metallurgists, like you see with working with iron or bronze or whatever metal they were working with. The rulers of these societies were considered to be divine. This is where many of these, well, all of the rulers took their authority from the gods. So it's like, why am I in power? Because the gods said I should be in power. And not only that, I am going to also myself be semi-divine. Or just plain old divine. Like in Egypt, the kings were considered to be part of the sun god. So they were god incarnates. This is why if you were an Egyptian ruler, a pharaoh, you had to marry your sister to keep the bloodlines pure. Um, this this was a connection between the gods and the people. And we call this type of government with a divine authority, theocracy, from the Greek root. Another thing about these states was that they had big militaries. This was used both to promote the ruler's power, but it was also used as a tool of expansion of territory. Um, these two this is from these two images are from the Louvre in Paris, and this is a Babylonian, like, or Mesopotamian, let's just call him Mesopotamian creature that was supposed to protect, a mythical creature that was supposed to protect the military and the rulers. And those are the gates, the ones that this lovely uh, traveling companion of mine is standing between the gates of the city. So these huge creatures were protecting the city, but they were also protecting soldiers. As you can see here, they were protecting these ships that were going into battle. And I don't know if you can really make out these ships, but here is one of them. You can see the different oars, and then like the huge oars at the end to help steer the ship and help keep it floating. And if any of you are sailors, you can definitely correct me on that. Okay, so these smaller states, which is what we call basically like a country, turned into empires, meaning they expanded into territory that they originally didn't have, and that was populated with people who didn't speak the same language as them and didn't necessarily have the same culture, or didn't have the same culture. So what allowed some states to become empires? Well, the first thing is technological and resource advantages. So people like the Hittites, who had access to iron, um, were able to make better weapons and wheels. That meant they could have better chariots, which meant it was easier to conquer you. The first technological advantage people had was in terms of agriculture. Agriculture would also be considered a resource advantage because um, because you would have more of a surplus of food. You wouldn't be struggling so much to just survive. The struggle is real, but it would be less of a struggle. Um, so you could have more people as specialists. So the earliest empire is started by Sargon of Akkad, and it's in Mesopotamia, and they are the Sumerians. Um, then you have the Babylonians and the Assyrians. And this is King Menes from Egypt. So the Egyptian crown is actually a combination of two crowns, the crowns of the lower and the upper kingdom in Egypt, and he actually combined those two crowns together when he united the kingdom as a whole, which is kind of a cool symbolism there. All right, so if you were king, you would have a lot of people who were paying tribute to you, maybe even Miss Naylor. This is again from the Louvre. These offerings showed reverence to the king. And also you could see like the god was definitely behind the throne, and here the god is anthropomorphic or very human-like. Okay, so now we're going to look at a little bit more specifically how these societies brought this stuff together. So we're going to start with China. I'm not going to write a ton on this slide because I already talked about Huanghe and how the Yellow River was really considered to be China's, like, it was obviously a benefit to have this huge river that was so powerful, but also it was very powerful and it sometimes jumped its banks and destroyed whole cities, and so flood control was very, very important. The earliest communities were from 5000 to 3000 BC, and they were really focused in, oops, I'm just going to cross this out, pottery and bronze. So that was the first combo metal that they really controlled, and bronze was better than just plain old like old school iron because it was a combination, and it was more malleable and flexible and stuff. So the Shah dynasty is really where we see the first Chinese dynasty. They started in 2200 BCE, and this was a hereditary monarchy, so you got power from your dad. And the thing that they controlled, and this is found in Chinese poetry, is that they were controlling the floods through dikes and irrigation systems. So they're basically making sure everybody didn't die. Then they are taken over by the Shang, and you can see the dates of their empire there. They were, this was one of those empires who had a great military, and they took over like different basically mines. So they controlled metal. Access to metal, and so that was really good until the Zhou started to take that control, and they start to perfect the iron metallurgy, and they monopolized. They actually had a state monopoly of metal production. Again, if you want more specificity here, I would encourage you to read your book about the society. And as you can see, it's kind of like a little egg here. You know, societies kind of expand out. How did these rulers justify their power? Through the mandate of heaven. The leader was supposed to have the ability and the virtue to be a ruler. So when you were a ruler, you were considered to be like smiled upon by heaven, and this meant that you were ruling well, and you were also a good person. And I mean, in terms of being a ruler, and this justified like your power. So you said, okay, I'm the leader because I have the mandate of heaven. Heaven has smiled upon me. But this mandate could be revoked, and was revoked many times in Chinese history by basically poor rule. This meant that the will of the people was very important. The Chinese, more personally, like in their personal lives or by clan, really worship ancestors. So these ancestors were people that they would pray to, and were kind of the vehicle between between heaven and the world. And this mandate was separate. Oops, sorry about that. From these ancestors. So the Chinese didn't really consider themselves to know a ton about this what was going on in heaven, but they knew it was there. They trusted it. They knew that that if they performed the rituals to their ancestors, that things would be good for them. So what we end up with in China, and this is really important, especially for later time periods, because it's going to take us all the way to the 20th century, is the mandate of heaven and the dynastic cycle. So here's the cycle. The mandate is passed. So here we have the passing of the mandate, right? And when once one dynasty loses the mandate and another dynasty gains it, a new dynasty comes to power. And the emperor typically makes reforms, and people's lives are improved because of those reforms. For example, they might reform taxes, or they might reform land distribution. But as time goes on, as it always happens, there are wars or invasions or terrible terrible famines or something. And because of these issues, the government is forced to raise taxes to pay for, either the infrastructure that they need to repair, or like the invasions, or, a big wall that they want to build to stop people from invading. And when they do that, government spending increases, and with increased spending will probably come corruption, because people aren't perfect. That, coupled with environmental disaster, generally leads to a loss of respect for the dynasty, and many people would join their landlords, or excuse me, join forces and attack their landlords, the representatives of government, most locally. And somebody generally would then unite them and defeat the emperor. And here, this is when the mandate is passed. But the reason for the passing of the mandate is because of this stuff, right? The government isn't doing as good of a job, so they kind of deserve it in the Chinese mind. Okay, next we're going to get into pastoralists and their role, and then from there we're going to move into some cultural stuff.